So we're about 15 miles north of the Museum of Art and History here in the California desert, north of Rosamond and Lancaster. There's a moment where the pavement ends and the desert begins, and past here is just a whole lot of emptiness.
Desert towns have a very distinct border in most cases. People build their houses next to other people's houses, even though they could build them in the wide open spaces. So you're 1 minute in a civilized residential area and the next minute you're not.
So here we are at the museum in Lancaster. This exhibit, Land Artifacts, combines a variety of different elements. There's the black and white infrared photographs. There's a text that Chris wrote. We have a video that we produced in collaboration with KCET's Artbound. And Artbound is also a place where High and Dry lives, where you can go see the photos, you can see the text and the video online. And then in addition to that, we're very proud to be the first artists to use artifacts from Moah's permanent collection. The reason we have all these elements brought together is to give a more comprehensive view of the California desert and a more immersive experience for people who come to see the show.
I've lived in the Mojave Desert for about 45 years, and during that time I've seen lots of things left behind in the desert. So I know there's industrial ruins and there are memorials and there are artifacts, personal artifacts, which we have here. And then we have also kind of decaying garbage. And actually we have some landscapes that have been restored. So I began to realize that from all those things we can learn about ourselves, and we can also learn what we want for the future.
So on the floor we see some artifacts that Chris collected, most of it from within just a few blocks of the museum here. There was a vacant desert lot, and the rest he collected in Lone Pine where he lives. And then in the box here is a time machine. We've invited museum visitors to add a small personal item that they'd like to be remembered for, and the time capsule will then be stored by the museum until 2050. So the photographs in this exhibit are black and white infrared exposures. And for those who aren't familiar, infrared light is a kind of radiation that's just outside the human visual spectrum. So it's a kind of light that's a little bit redder than the red that we can see with our own eyes. One of the challenges that a landscape photographer has is to try to take photographs in the middle of the day. Most photographers just stay away from that time because it tends to be hazy and dusty. There's very little contrast. The sun is directly overhead and there's no shadows. So the solution that most photographers have is just to avoid shooting during the day. My feeling was that if you're going to represent the desert, it's important to shoot that critical part of the day because so much of the desert experience involves being outside in the heat with the sun directly overhead. For one thing, infrared light penetrates dust better than visual light. And another thing that infrared does is just by the nature of it, has more contrast and it has more detail, and it makes the images pop a little. And then the one way that you can really see that a photograph is infrared, because infrared light is towards the red part of the spectrum, the sky, which is blue, gets no exposure. So you can see in most of the photographs the sky is almost black. And for me, I think the casual observer might not even notice that the sky is black, but it creates a sort of surrealism or a sort of strangeness to the photograph. And my experience, my personal experience of the desert, is that it's a little bit strange, it's a little bit outer-worldly, and by making the sky black, I think it helps to communicate that sense that you have of being in another world.
A lot of people think that our garbage that we leave behind in our society and in the desert is not very important. Here we see a bunch of artifacts that came from the Museum of Art and History's collections, and we selected them for various reasons. They're kind of thematic in different places. But a lot of times the artifacts that we learn about the people of the past and how they lived were just abandoned by them. They were either broken or they no longer needed them. And so they are in some ways very similar to what we find around our deserts and around our everyday life.
Another reason why I chose to include only black and white photographs in this is because there's a long history of black and white landscape photography in California. And particularly this part of the California desert, near the museum here, the Eastern Sierra, is a place where the great American photographers practiced their craft, people like Ansel Adams and the Westons. And their work was in black and white, initially because that was a kind of film that was available, and then later, as an aesthetic choice, they continued to shoot black and white.
So these are artifacts that we would consider antiques, maybe, only because they're older, but we can learn about people's lifestyle from them. And so I went out in the desert and I collected artifacts that are being left behind now. And it may not seem very important, but these actually tell people of the future, create a story of how we have lived. And so I think we have to think about that and decide what kind of story we want to leave for our children, grandchildren, and all the people that come after us.